Today we're talking about this, the Sony a7 IV, and this just might be the last camera review I ever make. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and these are fake bananas. First up, for disclosure, Sony lent me this camera to make this review, but as usual, they aren't paying me for this coverage and they don't get to preview the video before it goes live. This video does have an actual sponsor though, and that's Storyblocks. In my recent Canon R6 Mark III review, I suggested that cameras basically felt solved to me with these last few releases, at least as far as balancing sensor speed, features, and image quality in that middle price bracket. And part of the reason why I felt confident in saying that is because at the same time I was testing that R6 Mark III, I was also testing this a7 IV. And when it comes to price, sensor performance, and basic capabilities, they are extremely similar, which means we now have really competitive and solid options from Sony, Nikon, Canon, and Lumix in that price bracket. So there's never been a better time to be in the market for a hybrid camera. You really can't choose wrong. But today we're going to focus on what the Sony offers. So starting with the build, this thing is pretty identical to the a7 IV, but with two major upgrades. Thankfully, it inherits the screen mechanism from the Alpha 1 II and the A9 III, the one that can tilt up and down, flip, and rotate. This is the best screen in the business, and I'm glad to see it here. They've also doubled the resolution on the display compared to the original a7 IV, which was much needed. In a perfect world, we also would have gotten the body of the Alpha 1 II with that improved grip and button depth, but I guess they got to save something for the flagship. The other change is there are now two USB-C ports. The bottom one operates at USB 2.0 speeds, but can still be used for power delivery, and the top one is a full 10 gigabit per second port that does both power and high-speed data transfer. This is a very useful combination because it means you can keep your camera juiced up while tethering, or you could use one port for power and one for Ethernet, for example. And the UVC webcam capabilities over these ports are now upgraded to the full 4K 30, something that the a7 IV was missing. Other than that, it's an a7 IV body, but with a new sensor. The resolution of the sensor is the same at 33 megapixels, but now it's much faster. In my rolling shutter tests, I measured 14.1 milliseconds to read full-frame 4K 24, which is oversampled from 7K. For comparison, the a7 IV will get closer to 27 milliseconds in that same test. So this is nearly twice as fast, which will have a significant impact on perceived jello in fast pans and frenetic movements. And it also means this camera is capable of full-frame oversampled 4K 60, which got a read time of 13.1 milliseconds. Now there's a reason why this speeds up a little, and there is a new setting in the menu that needs to be explained. When you set the camera to 4K 60, or if you set it to 4K 120 in APS-C mode, you'll have the option to enable a new item called 4K Angle of View Priority. Enabling this will give you a matching field of view to the slower frame rates, but it comes at the cost of turning off high ISO noise reduction. If you disable this priority, the frame gets cropped in about 16%, and you retain your high ISO noise reduction. In my briefing, they assured me that nothing else was changing, no other features were being lost by enabling this, and I personally went through and checked every major function to make sure there were no other catches to turning this on, and I couldn't find any. When I first heard about this, I thought, so I get to have full-frame 4K 60 and reduce the noise reduction? Sign me up. I say this because I usually find in-camera noise reduction to be a bit too heavy-handed, and we'll get into the noise specifically in a later section, but first, let's finish talking about sensor speed. This sensor is also much more capable when it comes to action photography. The max burst speed jumps from 10 frames per second on the a7 IV to 30 frames per second here, and that's full subject tracking, blackout-free, and with no compromises in image quality. It retains the same 759-point autofocusing system and AI processing of the Alpha 1 Mark II, but unlike the A1 II, if you prefer to stick to mechanical shutter, this camera still gives you control over the electronic front curtain, so you can go full mechanical actuation if you want. The buffer and burst duration gets a bit tricky though. There's 3 RAW modes on this camera: lossless compressed, compressed, and a new compressed HQ. Currently, I find the new HQ mode to be peculiar, and I'm wondering if it's performing as intended because the file sizes are identical to the regular compressed, but the buffer fills as quickly as lossless. This seems illogical to me, so I reached out to Sony for an answer, but haven't heard back at the time of recording this. If I get an answer before publishing, I'll insert it now. Otherwise, check if there's a pinned comment below. But for now, let's ignore that HQ mode. When using the full 30 FPS burst, you can only shoot about 40 frames of lossless and 100 frames of compressed RAW before that buffer fills. That's a 1.3 and 3.3 second burst respectively. Dropping to 20 frames per second got me 50 frames of lossless and 170 of compressed, and dropping to 50 FPS got me 65 shots in lossless and didn't seem to have a limit in compressed mode. And 10 frames per second had no limit in either mode, meaning the buffer cleared as fast as the camera was shooting. This was using the CF Express A slot on the camera. It has the same card slots as the a7 IV, by the way, so one combo slot and one just SD card slot, but you maintain redundant and relay recording in photo and video for the modes that both slots can support. So, on quick glance, these burst rates would seem like a major step down from something like the Alpha 1 II and even the Canon R6 Mark III. But like I said, it's tricky. On the Alpha 1 II, the camera automatically drops to 20 FPS in its least compressed modes, and in order for the Canon R6 Mark III to hit its 40 frames per second burst and larger buffer, it drops the color depth down to 12-bit. The A7 IV manages to keep its 30 frames per second target at 14 bits even when shooting lossless RAWs, which neither of those other cameras can do, and it's actually pretty impressive. It just can't do it for very long. Also, the pre-capture of the A7 IV is superior to the Canon, allowing you up to 1 full second before you press the shutter, with fine control of interval and burst speed during that pre-capture. Sony also claims up to 16 stops of dynamic range in those RAWs, and showed during the briefing that they have the cleanest shadows in the category. This will have to be validated when we get the full compatibility with the various photo editing programs, which I don't have currently. But it actually gets a bit crazier. I mentioned that this camera also has the AI processing unit, but the architecture has changed. Previously, Sony cameras used the Bions XR, which was a dual-chip processing unit, with some cameras getting an additional AI chip on top of that. The A7 IV is using the new Bions XR2, which combines the two previous chips plus the AI chip into one unit, which not only brings higher performance, but much better efficiency. This means the battery life is actually 23% better than the A7 IV, despite the camera being twice as fast. And it's rated for over 600 single-frame viewfinder shots, compared to most other cameras in this category getting results in the 300s. So while 30 FPS lossless can only be maintained for just over a second, you can shoot over 8 seconds of 20 FPS compressed RAWs in 14-bit color with 16 stops of dynamic range, with a much more efficient battery and the best pre-capture in the class. Comparing all that to the A7 IV, and this camera is a substantial upgrade for photography. Now, dynamic range in video was something I could test, so I busted out the Zyla 21 and got to work. As you can see along the top, all of these tests were in S-Log3, and starting with 4K 24 at ISO 800, we measured a total dynamic range of 14.2 stops with a medium score of 12.5. The medium score is how many stops were good and clean with a signal-noise ratio of 2. If we compare that to the A7 IV, we can see it's pretty similar, but the A7 IV gained about a third of a stop on the medium, but a worse result for overall pixel noise and notably worse on the high score. So I took a closer look at that noise and noticed two things. I believe the A7 IV has a more processed look than the A7 V. The noise is suppressed more, which starts to look increasingly worse the deeper into the shadows you go. The A7 V is more similar to what we saw in the FX2, where the noise is allowed through in a much more natural way, which does lower the medium score a bit, but allows for more details to be retained after the noise reduction. I wonder if this has something to do with the AI processing, which the A7 IV doesn't have. I ran some tests where I shot an underexposed, dimly lit scene, boosted it in post, and compared different ISOs. The A7 IV is clearly mushier the higher we go. The A7 V, on the other hand, is noisier, yes, but retains much more detail and contrast. The second native ISO on the A7 V is different as well. It occurs much higher at ISO 8000. You can see that if we run the tests at ISO 6400, we're getting less than 10 stops, but when we jump to ISO 8000, we gain back about 2/3 of a stop and lower the pixel noise by 25%. Certainly not as clean as ISO 800, but better than shooting at 6400. Now let's talk about that angle of view priority switch again, the one that trades off noise reduction for keeping the full frame field of view. In 4K 60 with priority enabled, which means full frame but less noise reduction, we get about the same result as 4K 24. Slightly worse pixel noise and a bit worse on the high score, but a reasonable trade-off for maintaining your field of view. If we disable the priority mode, which adds a 16% crop and re-enables the noise reduction, then we get an identical result to the 4K 24. Same pixel noise, same high score, same everything. I also reran these tests at ISO 8000 to see if the impacts would be bigger up there, and they weren't really that much different. Very similar whether priority is enabled or disabled. But let's run through that ISO range so you can see what 10 or 20% more noise looks like. So first, here it is at 4K 24. When it switches from ISO 6400 to 8000, you can see that second native cleanup, and then it continues all the way to ISO 102,400, which is quite noisy, but better than I expected. Also, the color is impeccably well maintained throughout the range. I didn't notice any hue shifts at all, even when switching from ISO 800 to 100,000. Now, let's compare the 4K 60 with priority enabled and disabled to see how much impact that noise reduction is having. At ISO 800, there's barely a difference. I had to jump to ISO 6400 to make it noticeable. But then at ISO 8000, the difference is minimized again. But once you get to the really high ISOs, then you can see how much cleaner the priority off 16% crop version is. I think for me, in most cases, I'd rather just have the full frame and deal with a little extra noise. But this camera also shoots 120 frames per second, but only in APS-C mode. So if we jump into APS-C and run the tests again, we can see something interesting. First off, in 4K 24, the read speed doesn't change, still 14 milliseconds, and the dynamic range is nearly identical as well. We saw something similar to this on the Canon C50, where rather than just crop in on the frame and do nothing with the saved read time, these cameras are using that extra time to do enhanced image sampling and processing to maintain dynamic range even when in APS-C. And you can keep this benefit all the way up to 4K 60 with no changes. But once you enable 4K 120, then it goes back to the expected APS-C result, where the sensor is only reading that smaller portion of the frame, dropping to just 7 milliseconds. And none of that extra sampling is taking place because it needs all that speed to record 120 frames per second. And understandably, the dynamic range drops to typical APS-C levels of around 11.5 stops on the medium. Also, as I mentioned, 4K 120 and APS-C has that same option for angle of view priority. When it's enabled, 4K 120 will match 4K 24 in APS-C, but when it's disabled, an additional crop is applied, and once again, the trade-off is noise reduction. Here's a side-by-side of the 4K 120 and the 4K 24 to show the detail is maintained even when shooting at higher frame rates, which is good to see. And here's one comparing the A7 IV to the A7 V, both in full-frame 4K 24. I use the same lens on both cameras, but I do see a bit more chromatic aberration on the A7 IV. Perhaps the suppression algorithms are better on the new camera. It could just be a fluke in the testing, but I ran it multiple times. But the main reason for this comparison was to show that the A7 V maintains the incredible detail that we've come to appreciate on the A7 IV. There is a slight difference in color though. You can see how the red is more orange and vibrant on the A7 IV. In fact, the A7 V more closely matches the FX2 for color. You can see on the vector scope comparison that it's more saturated overall and brings the reds and skin tones more towards magenta, which creates a more even and neutral look in my opinion. It's a minor difference, but it's there. But I will be adding the A7 V to my Sony LUT pack so that you can color match it with any of the other cameras I cover, whether those are Sony cameras or any other brand. If you've already ordered my Sony pack, expect to get an email with LUTs for this camera as a free upgrade. And if you haven't purchased yet, please consider it. I create extremely color accurate LUTs that will bring your log clips into post-ready 709 footage that is color matched to the rest of your cameras in just one step. Thanks. Now, when I was doing that low light comparison I showed earlier, I noticed that the autofocus was hunting on the A7 V when shooting that extreme ISO 51200 test, but the A7 IV didn't. So I did a side-by-side over-underexposure autofocus test to investigate. First up, for backlit underexposure, yes, the new A7 V failed to track me 1/3 of a stop sooner than the A7 IV failed, both getting a passing grade, but it's interesting that the older camera with the worse autofocusing system eked out a small victory here. Only 1/3 of a stop, but peculiar. But on overexposure, the new camera won by a huge margin. The A7 IV started struggling around 4.5 stops over, but the A7 V continued tracking up to nearly 7 stops overexposed. To be fair, I think I'd rather have the extra 1/3 of a stop on the low end, but still an impressive range nonetheless. And thankfully, the A7 V inherits all the latest video autofocus bells and whistles, including the human pose estimation and all the different subject types, as well as the auto switching option that I love on my Alpha 1 too. Stabilization has been improved. Sony is rating it at 7.5 stops, but compared to the A7 IV, you're getting all the new stuff like the framing stabilizer, AI auto framing, and of course dynamic active stabilization. I did some basic tests here on a dreary, late November day and found that the standard IBIS felt pretty normal for Sony, which means no wobbles or anything, but pretty shaky. Active IS, which applies a small crop, felt pretty darn smooth though for follow shots, even with heavy foot drops. And dynamic active, which applies an even greater crop, was stellar, nearly gimbal-like and fully capable of handling a light jog without upsetting the frame too much. And here's a tighter comparison with consistent framing at a brisk walk to highlight the differences. I'm impressed, and I think this improved stabilization, mixed with the significantly faster read speed, should make for much more pleasing handheld shots. But why don't we test that? I'll wander around the studio here, because it's too miserable to go outside, and we can test a vlog-style video while I tell you about Storyblocks, the sponsor of today's video. Okay, so I'm just going to wander around the basement a little bit. I'll probably do some faster than usual movements to see what the rolling shutter looks like. For stabilization, I have it on active stabilization on like a 16mm focal length, but I have focus breathing compensation turned on, so it's a little bit more punched in. I've got auto exposure, auto white balance. We're just going to let the camera take care of everything. And then for audio, I just have a Rode VideoMic NTG on top of the camera for sound. So Storyblocks is a stock media platform that offers unlimited downloads of diverse and high quality content for one predictable subscription cost. Choose a monthly or annual plan and enjoy a library of over 1 million HD and 4K video files, images, and motion graphics templates, including a continually expanding library of DaVinci Resolve templates that I've come to really appreciate. And more importantly, all those assets are created by real people sharing real experiences, Because in this age of artificial intelligence, where an increasing volume of what we see online is generated by AI, Storyblocks is proud to be providing authentic stock content created by actual artists that AI can't replicate. Plus, anything you download from Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free with clear-cut licensing so you can focus on creating, not worrying about usage rights. The platform is incredibly easy to use, and the library is frequently restocked with commission content based on customer demand to ensure you'll have access to files that are not only high quality, but fresh and diverse. So to streamline your workflow and get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/undone or click the link in the video description. Another significant improvement compared to the A7 IV is overheating. I already mentioned that the processor is much more battery efficient now and will get you longer record times, but it's also more heat efficient, and this camera has a vastly improved thermal design compared to the A7 IV. Starting off in 4K 24 oversampled, full frame with a fully charged battery, I got 2 hours and 57 minutes of record time before the battery died with no heat warnings. That's incredible. That's 3 hours of 4K on a single charge. These overheating tests were done at a stable 22 degrees Celsius, by the way, which is about 72 Fahrenheit. Next, I put it in 4K 60 oversampled full frame with field of view priority on, and I got 2 hours and 5 minutes on a fully charged battery, again with no heat warning. I think that might be the best 4K 60 result I've ever gotten on a hybrid camera. This is the stuff that Sony is the best at. The computational efficiency to get over 2 hours of 4K 60 on a nearly 9-year-old battery design is incredible. Also, for the first time ever in a briefing, Sony provided numbers for their overheating performance. They claimed the 4K 60 should last at least 90 minutes at 68 Fahrenheit, which is 20 Celsius, and at least 60 minutes at 105 Fahrenheit, which is 40 C. Now, I can't test the 40 Celsius claim, but the fact that they're willing to make it in the first place says something. They've never made a claim like that before, and considering how well it worked in my studio, I'm willing to believe them about the 40C results too. Because instead of 90 minutes of 4K 60 at 68 degrees, I got over 6 hours of 4K 60 at 72 degrees. Now, let's pause here for a second. I recently made a similar claim about the Canon R6 Mark III, and it was a blunder on my part. The Canon was only actually operating at 4K 30 because I incorrectly set the shutter speed. But something I couldn't tell you at the time is the reason why I thought the Canon test was working correctly is because I was doing it right beside the A7 IV and the Sony wasn't having any issues. That's why I concluded, well, I guess cameras are solved now, because it seemed like both Sony and Canon can record indefinitely at 4K 60. However, when I realized my mistake on the Canon, I also noticed that I didn't make that mistake on the Sony. And when I went back and tested it a second time with proper settings on both, the Canon overheated in just 30 minutes, but I still got over 6 hours on the Sony. Here's a photo I took of the A7 V screen to prove it. You can see the shutter speed is set correctly, and it shows 4K 60 had already been recording for 5 hours and 28 minutes. I was using subject tracking, I had USB-C power connected, the heat threshold was set to high, I was using a CF Express Type A card in H.265 with the full frame priority on, and the screen was pulled away from the body. And after 6 hours, it didn't even feel that hot. Then to rule out some kind of environmental factors, I put the A7 IV next to it and set them both to 4K 60 APS-C mode and let them rip. The A7 IV overheated in just over an hour, but the A7 V kept recording for hours after that without even a warning. This is easily the best thermal performance I've seen on a camera without a fan, and it actually beats many competitors with fans, which is crazy to me. Okay, now let's do a roundup of things that are improved and other things that still suck. Actually, first up, here's a new issue that almost feels like a pre-production bug, which I've already reported to Sony, but the zebras on this camera are fainter than on any other Sony camera, but only when in certain modes. If you use lower limit to set a max clipping zebra, they're fine. But if you use the exposure range option for setting middle gray, they're much fainter than on other Sony cameras. Peculiar, and hopefully gets addressed. This camera now has the log shooting mode that we've seen multiple times since the A7 IV came out. The 4 never got it, but the A7 V does. But this also means it has the weird issue where you can't output 4K over HDMI when in log shooting mode. You have to create a custom picture profile to do 4K over HDMI instead. This is a weird quirk that's been happening for a while now and still isn't solved here. And if you opt to put your menus and on-screen info on the HDMI feed, the LCD screen turns off in the camera. Another issue that's been plaguing Sony cameras for years, if you want both screens on, the HDMI feed can only be a clean one. And my biggest gripe with Sony is still present on this camera, which is the no 25 or 30p when shooting H.265. It just skips from 24 straight to 60. If you want to shoot 30p, you need to use H.264. They've never explained why this is or fixed it. I was hoping that would somehow be solved in this camera, but no. But this camera does get the new video interface, which is nicer than the A7 IV. It has importable user LUTs and improved AI white balancing with better accuracy and a more customizable target box with a resizable reticle. It also gets the clear image zoom upgrade, where using that feature doesn't cost you anything when it comes to autofocus performance or subject detection like it did on the A7 IV. And it also inherits the still creation when in video mode that we saw on the FX2. This basically allows you to customize your camera so you can add shot marks with the shutter button while shooting video, and then have the camera automatically process those shot marks as JPEGs when you finish recording. It's a cool function. And lastly, just like the FX2, they added a vertical mode so that if you're shooting 9:16 content, the files are flagged as such, and the entire interface rotates on the LCD to match. And while we're on the topic of 9:16 content, let's talk for a minute about OpenGate. This camera does not have it. It also doesn't have internal RAW video, but I don't think anyone's surprised about that one. Now, I'm not going to be making any excuses for Sony here. I believe this camera is capable of OpenGate based on how fast the sensor is, so they could have added it if they wanted to. I also think it's better to have a feature and not need it than to not have it at all. However, I absolutely despise the rhetoric I see online about OpenGate. So if you're one of those people who makes claims like, any camera that doesn't have OpenGate is dead, feel free to ignore this next section, as I'm now going to address the sensible shoppers who are truly wondering if not having OpenGate is going to ruin their lives. No, it's not. If you want my honest opinion, OpenGate is probably the most overrated feature of recent years. There's two commonly touted use cases for it: more headroom for cropping out a 9:16 image, and anamorphic ratios. The anamorphic argument is weaker on a 3:2 sensor though. For a 4:3 sensor, it makes more sense, but 3:2 OpenGate anamorphic leads to crazy wide aspect ratios in many cases. And let's be honest, if you're an anamorphic enthusiast, you should probably be buying a Lumix camera anyway. They've got all the D-squeeze and stabilization options to make your life way easier. So what about 9:16 reframes? That's where it's grossly overrated, and I can prove it. Here is a 16:9 video clip shot on the A7 IV, and here is a 3:2 still photo taken on the same camera in the same position at the same focal length to use as our example of what OpenGate would look like on the A7 V. Now, using the 16:9 frame, let's zoom out until we get the same vertical space top to bottom. That's it. Just a few millimeters difference on the lens, or physically backing up the camera a little, gets you the same headroom as OpenGate. And if you drop both of these into a 9:16 timeline, the end result is identical. This concept was always known as headroom. Leave more headroom if you'll need it later. But the camera bros online are presenting it like it's some kind of magical concept. They're basically saying they can put their cameras in a certain mode that lets it create headroom for them automatically for reframing later. And they're not wrong, but it comes at a cost. OpenGate modes always have reductions in things like read speed, bit depth, frame rates, image quality, battery life, and thermal performance, just to achieve something that can be done by zooming out a little without giving up any of those other things. Now, the zoomed out 16:9 version will have slightly less vertical resolution than a tighter OpenGate recording, but no one is going to be able to see a quality difference on any of the platforms that let you deliver 9:16 content, and you're going to have to do the same amount of work in post no matter what. Anyway, that's the end of my OpenGate rant. Should Sony have included it? Yes. Should it dissuade you from seriously considering this or any other camera from any other brand without OpenGate? Not at all. It's not necessary. All right, let's wrap up. I'm an A7 IV user. I'm shooting this video on one right now. And when I first heard about the A7 V, I was wondering what I thought Sony would need to do to make this camera worthy of a recommendation. I decided I basically wanted an A7 IV that had much less rolling shutter jello, could do 4K 60 full frame, had the new flippy dippy screen, better thermal performance, and to trickle down all the new features we saw since the release of the A7 IV. I also wanted it to get the Alpha 1.2 body, but other than that, they delivered on every front. I do wish they had fixed some of those persistent quirks I mentioned, and I really wish this camera had shutter angle. And false color waveforms would be nice. But I do think they succeeded to reach my expectations on most fronts, and definitely on the most important ones. I would absolutely recommend this camera, and now that all the brands have had a chance to show their latest offerings in this category, I would pick this one from all the options if I had to start over from scratch as well. It's hard to deny the stability and reliability of this system. The pure performance and battery life are unmatched, the breadth of lens options is unbeatable, and now that the sensor is fast enough to compete on the sports photography stage, it truly is the most enticing full-frame option from Sony. It's 90% of an Alpha 1.2, but at less than half the price. And they've also managed to close the gap significantly on their weaker aspects like stabilization, which is now really quite good. But let's be honest, only YouTubers and bozos on the internet talk about switching camera systems like there's no consequences in doing so. Reasonable people realize that the brands have us in a stranglehold because we're committed to their lens system. I'm committed to Sony in that way, so I'm thrilled to have an excellent new option in that lineup. and one that I'd happily recommend. But I'm even more thrilled as a camera reviewer to comfortably say that no matter which brand has you in that lens mount headlock, just know that you're in good hands. All cameras are good now. I'm done.